Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive on a topic I know a lot of you have been wanting to hear about,
Yeah,
the Civil Rights Movement.
absolutely.
And, in particular, we got a lot of feedback from you guys saying,
Yeah.
is it really just all about these big, iconic figures, like Dr. King, or
Yeah.
was it, a much broader, much more kind of intricate kind of effort?
Yeah. Yeah, a lot more going on behind the scenes than people realize.
Totally.
Yeah.
And trust me, folks, as we get into this deep dive,
Mm-hmm.
you are going to be surprised by some of the things we uncover about this era.
Yeah, you're going to find out pretty quickly this wasn't a simple, single story.
Right. Yeah.
It was a lot of different groups,
Yeah.
different forces at work.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to try to unravel today.
Absolutely.
So we're going to be looking at national organizations. We're going to be looking at local activism, the role of the federal government.
Right.
And a lot of you specifically asked about the role of Black churches
Mm-hmm.
and women.
Yeah, those are essential parts of the story
Huge, huge parts of the story.
that we don't always hear enough about.
Okay, so let's jump right in. And I think a good place to start is with those national organizations,
Okay.
like the NAACP and the SCLC.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to think of those as these platforms for leaders like Dr. King.
Right.
But it seems like our sources are suggesting that their role was actually much more strategic than just that.
Absolutely. I think historian Stephen Lawson really hit the nail on the head when he talked about the importance of these groups.
Yeah, okay.
They weren't just there to amplify voices. They had the legal expertise, the resources to actually fight for change at the federal level,
Yeah.
which was something incredibly difficult for, local communities to do on their own.
So it wasn't just about visibility.
Right.
It was about having like the tools,
Yeah.
to navigate the legal system, to actually challenge segregation on a national scale.
Exactly. It's about having the know-how and the infrastructure to take on those legal battles.
Right. And I think the Montgomery Bus Boycott is a perfect example of this, right?
Oh, absolutely. A classic example.
So it starts as this local protest
Right.
fueled by, the community's just outrage over these segregated buses.
Yeah, Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat.
Right.
I mean, that sparked a whole citywide boycott.
But it was the NAACP's legal team
Mm-hmm.
that actually took that local action all the way to the Supreme Court.
Exactly, and that's where it gets really interesting.
Right.
They used their expertise to argue that segregation on buses was a violation of the Constitution.
Wow.
And they won.
They won.
They secured this landmark victory that really just reverberated across the entire nation.
And that victory set a powerful precedent, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Because now it's basically saying that
Okay.
segregation on public transportation is unconstitutional.
Yeah, it set the stage for future legal challenges across all sorts of areas.
Wow.
So you can really see how that local action combined with that national strategy
Yeah.
really made a huge difference.
Really powerful stuff.
But the fight wasn't just in the courtrooms, It was also happening in the halls of power in Washington, D.C.
Right.
And that brings us to the federal government's role, which is, it's complicated.
Yeah, was the government a friend or foe to the movement? I mean, our sources are kind of painting a
Oh, it's messy.
very, very complex picture.
Right. It's not a simple answer at all.
No.
I mean, on one hand, you have historians like Mark Newman who argue that certain federal policies were absolutely essential for progress.
Okay.
Think about President Franklin Delano Roosevelt,
FDR?
FDR, his appointments to the Supreme Court.
Okay.
Those appointments really created a more liberal court, which was much more receptive to arguments against segregation.
Hold on. Can you break that down for me a bit? What do you mean by a more liberal Supreme Court in this context?
Sure, yeah. So in this era, a more liberal court basically meant that the justices were more likely to interpret the Constitution in a way that favored individual rights and equality,
Got it.
which obviously had major implications for cases challenging segregation.
So FDR's appointments really helped create this legal environment where those challenges could gain traction.
Precisely. It shifted the balance of the court in a way that made it more likely for these cases to succeed.
Okay, that makes sense.
But then we also have Mary Dudziak's perspective on the Cold War, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
She argues that, in a way, the Cold War actually pushed the U.S. government to support civil rights.
What?
Yeah.
Really?
It's kind of counterintuitive, right?
Totally.
But remember, the U.S. was locked in this ideological battle with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, promoting democracy.
Exactly, trying to promote democracy and freedom around the world.
And meanwhile, you have this blatant racial segregation happening within the U.S. itself.
Which the Soviets were very quick to point out. They
Yeah.
used it as propaganda to undermine the U.S.'s claims of being this beacon of freedom.
Oh, so the U.S. was worried about looking hypocritical.
Exactly. Dedziak argues that the U.S. government felt this pressure to address racial discrimination at home, in part because they didn't want to appear hypocritical on the world stage.
Wow. I never considered that angle.
Yeah, it's a really interesting perspective.
So international pressure might have actually played a role in advancing civil rights.
It's definitely possible. Think about Eisenhower sending troops to integrate Little Rock High School in 1957.
Yeah,
While there was certainly domestic pressure to do that,
of course.
that move also sent a strong message to the world about America's supposed commitment to racial equality.
So even in the midst of this Cold War, civil rights became part of this global narrative about freedom and democracy.
Yeah, it became this unexpected battleground in the Cold War in a way.
That's wild.
Yeah.
But, we can't just focus on the positive side of this, right?
Yeah.
Because we also had James Patterson, another historian we're looking at, who points out that this Cold War anxiety also had a darker side.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a flip side to that coin.
Okay.
He argues that the government was so fearful of communist infiltration that they targeted and suppressed some black activist groups.
What?
Yeah,
Really?
because they perceived them as being sympathetic to communism.
So progress on one hand, suppression on the other.
Yeah, it's a really complicated picture.
That is pretty jarring.
It highlights the complexities and contradictions of this era.
Yeah.
As historian Stephen Lawson put it, the federal government made racial reform possible, but blacks in the South made it necessary.
Okay.
It was this constant push and pull between top-down policy and bottom-up activism.
Yeah.
But to really understand that bottom-up part, we need to zoom in on the local level, which is what we're going to get into next.
Absolutely.
And I know that's something you're particularly interested in.
Yeah, and I think a good place to start is with the Black church.
Oh, okay.
Because it seems like it played such a huge role in mobilizing communities and providing this foundation for the movement.
It's impossible to talk about the civil rights movement without acknowledging the central role of black churches.
Yeah.
I mean, they provided not just a physical space for meetings and organizing, but also this incredible support network for communities facing oppression and violence.
I mean, think about people like Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker.
Absolutely.
Just working tirelessly at the grassroots level to register voters and empower their communities.
Yeah, they were the backbone of the movement in so many ways.
They weren't waiting for national figures to come in and lead the charge.
Right, they were making change happen from the ground up.
They were making things happen on their own terms.
Exactly, and their stories are so powerful.
They are.
And they really demonstrate just how broad and deep this movement really was.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember, as historian Claiborne Carson points out,
Okay.
that not all black churches were these progressive forces.
Wait, really? I always kind of assumed that black churches were uniformly supportive of the movement.
Yeah, it's a common assumption, but it's not entirely accurate.
Wow.
Some churches were actually quite conservative
Oh.
and actively discouraged activism.
Interesting.
They feared backlash from white authorities, disruption to their communities, or they just simply held different theological views.
So even within black communities,
Right.
there were these diverse viewpoints and internal debates about the best way to achieve equality.
Absolutely. It was a complex and multifaceted community with a range of perspectives.
That's such an important point,
It is.
because it's so easy to oversimplify things.
Right.
And I think, now I'm even more curious to hear about those unsung heroes you mentioned earlier, particularly the role of black women.
Yeah, let's dive into that next.
Okay, let's do it.
You're absolutely right to be curious about that.
Mhm.
We talk about the civil rights movement and we think about those big names right off the bat.
Right.
But the truth is, black women were the backbone of this whole movement.
Yeah.
Working tirelessly, often behind the scenes.
It seems like they were involved in every aspect of it.
Oh, absolutely.
From, organizing these protests to, strategizing the campaigns
Wow.
to, just keeping that momentum going in their communities.
Yeah, the glue that held everything together.
And yet their stories haven't always been given the recognition they deserve.
No, they haven't. And that's a point that historians like Vicki Crawford have been really working hard to correct.
Mm-hmm.
And thanks to their research, we're learning more and more about the vital roles these women played.
So who are some of these figures that you think we should all know about?
Well, there's Septima Clark.
Oh.
She was known as the mother of the civil rights movement.
Wow.
And she created these incredible citizenship schools
Okay.
to educate and empower black voters.
Wow.
to help them overcome all these systemic barriers that were designed to keep them from the polls.
It's amazing how something like education
Right.
can become such a powerful tool for social change.
Oh, absolutely. Education was key to dismantling those systems of oppression.
Yeah.
And then there's Diane Nash, incredibly brave and strategic activist,
Okay.
a key figure in the freedom rides, challenging segregation on interstate buses.
Uh-huh.
And she played a major role in the Birmingham campaign, which really brought those horrors of segregation to the nation's attention.
These women weren't just participating, they were leading.
Right.
They were strategizing.
They were making the tough decisions that shaped the course of the movement.
And their courage and dedication, I mean, it really challenges that male-centered narrative
Absolutely.
that we've so often inherited about this period.
It's a really important reminder that this wasn't just about a few charismatic leaders at the top.
Right.
It was a collective effort fueled by countless individuals, many of whom were these Black women working tirelessly at the grassroots level.
Makes you wonder how the movement might have unfolded differently without their contributions.
It's definitely something to think about.
Yeah.
And speaking of those charismatic leaders, I know you've been wrestling with this question of Dr. King's role and his legacy.
Yeah.
Was he truly indispensable, or would the movement have progressed in a similar way without him?
Right.
It's a question historians continue to debate.
I mean, I'm really curious to hear different perspectives on that.
Well, Claiborne Carson, who actually directed the King Papers Project at Stanford University,
Oh.
he argues that the movement was already gaining significant momentum
Okay.
before King really rose to national prominence.
Interesting.
And he points to the Montgomery Bus Boycott as a prime example.
Right.
Remember, it started as this local grassroots effort.
Right. Sparked by Rosa Parks.
Exactly. And then King gets involved and helps elevate it to national attention.
So Carson's saying that while King's involvement amplified the boycott's impact, the underlying forces of community organizing and resistance were already in motion.
Exactly. The seeds were already planted.
So are we saying that Dr. King was just a figurehead?
Oh, no, not at all. I
Okay.
don't think anyone would argue that.
Right. Because it doesn't seem quite right given his undeniable influence.
Right. And historian Anthony Badger, for instance, takes a different view.
Okay.
He subscribes to what's sometimes called the great man theory of history,
Okay.
emphasizing the unique qualities and impact of certain individuals.
So in King's case, what were some of those qualities
Right.
that made him so influential?
Well, Badger points to King's charisma,
Of course.
his powerful oratory skills,
Yeah.
and his ability to really articulate this moral vision that resonated with millions of people
Yeah.
across racial and social lines.
It's true. I think about his I Have a Dream speech
Right,
and how it captured the nation's attention. I mean, it wasn't just about policy
right.
or legal argument.
No, it was about appealing to people's hearts
Right.
and their consciences,
Yeah,
inspiring them to imagine a different future.
exactly.
And King's ability to unify these diverse groups,
Yeah.
to appeal to the conscience of white America and to project this message of nonviolent resistance onto the global stage. I mean, these were crucial factors in the movement's success.
So it sounds like we're kind of moving away from this either scenario.
Yeah.
It wasn't just Dr. King and
Right.
it wasn't just grassroots activism or
Right.
federal intervention.
Exactly.
It was this incredible synergy of all these forces that really propelled the movement forward.
It was a complex ecosystem of change
Yeah.
with all these different parts working together.
Right.
National organizations fighting for legal change,
Uh-huh.
local communities mobilizing for direct action,
Right.
government policies shifting in response to all these pressures, both internal and external,
Yeah.
and countless individuals working tirelessly behind the scenes, often without recognition.
It really does feel like this tapestry woven from all these different threads.
Exactly.
Courage and sacrifice and determination.
A beautiful and complex tapestry. And
Yeah.
remember that quote from historian Stephen Lawson, "The federal government made racial reform possible, but blacks in the South made it necessary."
Yeah.
Really encapsulates the interdependence of all these different levels of activism.
Yeah, powerful stuff.
But as we come to the end of this deep dive,
Yeah.
I think it's crucial to ask, what does this all mean for us today?
Right.
Why should we care about this intricate history?
It's easy to see the civil rights movement as just a chapter in a history book.
Right.
But I think it's so much more than that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think understanding this history, especially, these lesser told stories, it really changes how we view the civil rights movement's legacy
Right.
and its relevance to, what we're dealing with today.
Absolutely.
It's a reminder that, progress isn't a straight line.
Right.
It takes constant work, and there are always going to be these setbacks along the way.
And it's not about just celebrating these iconic figures, It's about recognizing the everyday heroes.
Yeah.
Those community organizers, the women who kept this movement alive at that grassroots level.
Right.
Their stories remind us that social change doesn't just happen.
Wow.
It requires this sustained effort, collaboration, the courage to challenge the status quo.
I mean, it's inspiring to see how people came together, using their own unique skills and resources to create this really powerful force for change.
It really is. And that's what makes this history so relevant today.
Yeah.
We're still grappling with issues of inequality and injustice.
Right.
And the lessons of the civil rights movement can offer us some really valuable insights into how we might approach those challenges.
So it's not just a story about the past.
No.
It's a story about the forces that continue to shape our present.
Exactly.
And inspire us to work for a better future.
Absolutely. And that brings me to a final thought-provoking question for you all to consider as you reflect on all of this.
Yeah.
How does this understanding, this more nuanced understanding of the civil rights movement, change your perspective on social change today?
That is a great question to leave our listeners with.
Yeah. How can we learn from the past to create a better future?
What lessons can we draw from this history? As we grapple with these contemporary issues, whether it's racial justice, economic inequality, any form of systemic oppression.
The civil rights movement reminds us that even in the face of these seemingly insurmountable obstacles, collective action can make a difference.
Powerful stuff.
It's a call to action, an invitation to engage with the complexities of our time and find ways to contribute, no matter how big or small, to the ongoing fight for a more just and equitable society.
Well said.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the civil rights movement.
My pleasure.
Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep learning, and remember that history is never just about the past. It's about understanding the forces that shape our present and inspire us to create a better future.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.